In 1948, a man stood in a train corridor and listened through a curtain as a waiter read the evening menu to the passengers inside. He could not afford a seat in the dining car. He never forgot what he heard. Number 17 on this list was served on white linen with real silver, and no restaurant in America serves it today. Number 9 was the one dish no dining car chef was ever permitted to cut, even during wartime rationing. And number 3 appeared on every major rail menu beginning in 1876, then vanished completely. These 20 meals were America's promise that every passenger deserved to eat like they mattered. Hit that subscribe button. Number 20. Railroad consommé. The kitchens on long-haul trains ran day and night. Before the passengers woke up, before the first light appeared over the prairie, a pot of beef bones was already on the stove, simmering low. The consommé that arrived at your table was clarified until it was almost perfectly transparent, dark amber, trembling in a wide bowl. It had been cooking for 6 hours in a space smaller than most apartment bathrooms. Today, every wellness brand sells the same thing in a paper cup and calls it bone broth. They charge $14. The railroad served it as a first course. Number 19. Planked whitefish. This was a fish that arrived at your table still on the wood. The whitefish was scored, seasoned, and pressed flat against an oak plank that had been soaked and oiled. It went under the broiler and came out together with the board, the flesh pulling away from the skin in clean white layers, steaming against the grain of the wood. The plank itself was the serving dish. It was the most expensive presentation piece in the dining car kitchen, and it took 2 men to carry it correctly without burning themselves. Nobody carries a plank like that anymore. Number 18. Harvey House cream of tomato soup. Fred Harvey opened his first restaurant along the Santa Fe Railway in 1876. By the time the country entered the First World War, his Harvey houses were feeding travelers. At stops from Kansas City to Albuquerque, the cream of tomato soup they served was made each morning. Tomatoes cooked down until they thickened, then strained, then finished with cream heated separately so it would not break. The Harvey girls who carried it out moved fast and did not spill. Not a single original Harvey House recipe was ever officially recorded. That knowledge went with the women who held it. Number 17. Broiled Idaho trout. On the Union Pacific lines running through the Mountain West, local fishermen met the train at certain stations every morning. The trout came in wooden crates packed in river ice, still stiff, pulled from Idaho streams the same day. The dining car cook had maybe 40 minutes to clean, season, and broil them before the next mealtime. They were served whole, head-on, with lemon and drawn butter. The supply chain that made this possible, the fishermen, the station platform, the ice, the timing, no longer exists anywhere in the American railroad system. Number 16. Railroad oyster stew. The oysters on transcontinental trains came from the East Coast. They were packed in barrels of seawater and loaded into cold storage cars at stations along the Atlantic seaboard. By the time they reached the dining car, they were still alive. The cook dropped them into whole milk with a thick slice of butter and let them open slowly in the heat. They were served in a silver-rimmed bowl. The passenger ate while watching the Great Plains move past the window. The logistics of keeping live oysters alive across a continent no longer exists anywhere in the American food system. Number 15. Chicken a la King. This dish appeared on the menus of the 20th Century Limited, the Broadway Limited, the Super Chief, and every major overnight line running through the middle of the 20th century. It was the one item that crossed all the railroad brands. Strips of chicken breast in a cream sauce, flecked with red pimento and green pepper, served inside a val au vent pastry shell that shattered when you pressed a fork through it. The reason it showed up everywhere was simple. It traveled well, it held heat, and it made the dining car smell like something your grandmother would have made on a Sunday. It was the last item removed from railroad menus before the old dining standards disappeared for good. Before we get to number 14, there is something the industry record does not prominently feature. In 1958, the Boeing 707 entered commercial service. Within a few years, coast-to-coast air travel became something ordinary Americans could afford. Passenger numbers on the long-haul railroads began to fall. The railroad companies looked at their dining cars and saw the most expensive operation on the train. Fresh fish met at the platform. Oysters shipped alive across the country. Cream sauces made from scratch in a kitchen the size of a hallway. They started replacing it. Fresh ingredients became canned. Full menus became abbreviated. The chefs who had spent careers learning to cook in a moving vehicle retired, and the companies did not train replacements. Then, in 1971, Amtrak took over most of the nation's passenger rail lines. The budget was not there for white linen and silver service. The last dining cars running under the old private railroad standards were phased out quietly. There was no announcement. The men who cooked on the Super Chief went home, one of the finest dining experiences in the country. Your father might have ridden that train. Your kids flew southwest. Nobody decided to forget these meals. It happened slowly, then all at once. Number 14. Terrapin Stew. Maryland diamondback terrapin was once so abundant in the Chesapeake Bay that it was considered a poor man's food. By the late 19th century, wealthy Americans had made it fashionable, and the railroad dining cars of the Eastern lines served it as a premium dish. Terrapin meat was braised low and long in sherry and butter, finished with hard-boiled egg yolk pressed through a sieve. By the early decades of the 20th century, the terrapin population in the Chesapeake had collapsed. Railroad kitchens could not source enough to keep it on the menu. The dish did not go out of fashion. It ran out of turtles. Number 13. Deviled kidneys on toast. In the first half of the 20th century, kidneys were a breakfast item, not a curiosity, not a novelty, a standard. On the morning runs of the Great Eastern lines, beef kidneys were split, pressed flat, coated in a paste of butter and dry mustard, and laid under the broiler until the edges charred and the centers stayed just barely pink. They were placed on white toast, carried out while still sizzling. There were passengers who ordered nothing else. Today, most Americans cannot name the last time they saw organ meat on a breakfast menu. That shift happened inside of one generation. Number 12. Broiled sweetbreads. The sweetbread is the thymus gland of a young calf. In the railroad dining car era, it was considered one of the most delicate proteins a kitchen could offer. The preparation required time. The sweetbreads were blanched, waited overnight to firm them, then sliced thick and broiled with capers and brown butter, until the exterior crisped and the inside stayed tender and mild. Today, the same cut is trimmed at the slaughterhouse and discarded. What was once placed on a dining car table under a silver dome is now considered waste. The taste did not change. The patience did. Number 11. Creamed chipped beef on toast. This was the meal that went to war. Dried beef, shaved thin, folded into a cream sauce thick enough to stand a spoon in, poured over white toast. American soldiers ate it in mess halls from Georgia to Germany, and they gave it a name that cannot be repeated in polite company. But before the war, before the mess hall, it appeared on railroad breakfast menus across the country. The dried beef had been salted and pressed to last long journeys without refrigeration, and the cream sauce was made with whatever milk was on hand. Soldiers who hated it in the army remembered their grandmother making it differently. She was right. The dining car version was better. Number 10. Eggs Benedict. The origin of this dish is disputed, and the dispute does not matter. By the early 20th century, Eggs Benedict appeared on the breakfast menus of dining cars, running into New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. A poached egg over a round of Canadian bacon on a toasted English muffin, covered in hollandaise sauce made to order. The hollandaise was the hard part. It broke easily. Keeping it warm in a moving kitchen without scrambling it required a level of attention. That made it one of the most labor-intensive items on the menu. Today, you pay $22 for it at weekend brunch. On the train, it was a standard breakfast item, eaten while watching the city disappear behind you. Number 9. Railroad Club Sandwich. The club sandwich that came off the original railroad menus was not the thin, skewered construction you find in hotel room service today. It was 3 slices of bread, toasted, stacked high with sliced turkey, thick-cut bacon, ripe tomato, and enough mayonnaise that it was a serious project to hold. The portions were sized for a man who had been sitting on a train for 18 hours and had not eaten a real meal since the night before. The Railroad Club sandwich was not a light lunch. It was a commitment. The version that survived into the modern era lost an inch of height and everything else that made it worth ordering. Number 8. Corned beef hash. The hash came from the kitchen scraps. Corned beef that had been served the night before, chopped with cold boiled potatoes, pressed flat into a cast-iron pan and left alone until the bottom turned dark and crisp. The dining car cook did not rush the hash. He let it sit, and he knew by smell when it was ready to flip. The men who ordered it were usually the ones who had been awake all night, watching the dark country pass outside the window. It was not a delicacy. It was dignity at 6 in the morning. Before number 7, here is what the culinary record largely overlooked. The kitchen on a standard dining car was roughly 6 feet wide and 12 feet long. In that space, on a moving train, cooks produced full multi-course meals for 40 passengers at a sitting. No stabilizers, no flat surface, everything braced, timed, and held by hand. The conditions forced a level of preparation discipline that professional kitchens today teach under a French name mise en place. Every ingredient measured, prepped, and staged before service began, because there was no time to retrieve anything once the orders were coming in. The men who cooked in those kitchens did not go to culinary school. They learned the work on the job, in that specific space, under those specific conditions. They developed techniques for managing heat, timing, and volume in a way no stationary kitchen ever required. When they retired, they did not write any of it down. There was no book. There was no class. The California Zephyr was their culinary school, and it closed without ceremony. What looked like humble work was some of the most technically demanding cooking ever done in America. Nobody made a documentary about it. Number 7. Roast prime rib au jus. On the great overnight trains of the 1940s and 1950s, the prime rib came to the table on a cart. A full rib roast, still on the bone, had been cooking since early afternoon in the car's oven. When the cart reached your table, the attendant carved it for you there, in front of you, the knife moving through the crust and into the dark red interior. The juice ran into the silver pan beneath. You told him how thick you wanted it, and he cut it that way. This was the last formal tableside ritual that survived on American trains. It ended with Amtrak's budget changes in the early 1970s, and no version of it exists on an American train today. Number 6. Shrimp cocktail. In the passenger railroads of the mid-century, the shrimp cocktail sat in a silver cup filled with crushed ice. The shrimp curved over the rim, a small bowl of red sauce set inside. It was served as a first course on the premium dinner service. On some lines, if you were seated in coach and the dining car door happened to open at the right moment, you could see those silver cups lined up on the wait station through the gap. The passengers who could not afford the dining car knew exactly what was in there. The shrimp cocktail was not just a dish. It was the clearest possible view of the line between the cars. Number 5. Apple pan dowdy. This was the dessert that smelled like fall before you saw it. Apples packed tight into a deep dish with brown sugar, covered in a rough pastry top. That was pressed down into the filling halfway through baking, so the crust soaked up the juices and caramelized underneath. It came out of the oven dark and heavy and was served in the dish, spooned out at the table, with a pitcher of cream poured over. Most American women born before 1950 knew how to make it. Most American women born after 1975 have never eaten it. That gap is one generation wide, and it closed without anyone noticing. Number 4. Railroad sponge cake. Every morning, in the baker's section of the dining car kitchen, the sponge cakes went into the coal-fired oven before dawn. They were made from flour, eggs, sugar, and vanilla, beaten until the batter held its ribbon, poured into tin molds, and baked while the train moved through the dark. By the time the first passengers sat down for breakfast, the cakes had cooled and been sliced. The kitchen made only as many as the day required. There was no storage. Nothing was frozen. Nothing was sealed in plastic. The sponge cake existed for exactly one day, on exactly one train, and then it was gone. That is precisely why it disappeared in the modern food system. Something that cannot be packaged cannot survive. Number 3. Lobster thermidor. The 20th Century Limited ran between New York and Chicago from 1902 until 1967. It was called the greatest train in the world, and the dining car was the reason some passengers booked it. Lobster thermidor appeared on the dinner menu for decades. The lobsters came from Canada, loaded fresh at Grand Central Terminal each morning. By afternoon, when the train was moving through Pennsylvania, the dining car chef was already splitting the shells, mixing the mustard cream, filling them back, and setting them under the broiler. The whole service was timed to come out when the train was running smoothest, somewhere west of Philadelphia, where the track was level and the ride was steady. The 20th Century Limited made its final run in December 1967. The chef who last served lobster thermidor on that train retired not long after. Nobody asked him for the recipe. Number 2. The Pullman Porter's Meal. After the Civil War, George Pullman hired formerly enslaved men to work as porters on his sleeping cars. For decades, Pullman porters were among the most visible black professionals in America, serving passengers across every major rail line. They worked long shifts, carried bags, made beds, and addressed every passenger by their title. They ate after everyone else. They ate in the kitchen car, from what remained. But the cooks in the dining car, men who understood the food better than anyone else, kept back the best portions for them. Not the scraps, the best. It was never written into any policy. It was an arrangement between men who worked the same narrow space and understood what the other's day had cost him. The Pullman porter's meal never appeared on any menu. It was served with more care than anything else in that car. Number 1. The Last Dinner. On April 30th, 1971, Amtrak took over operations from the private railroad companies. That night, on dozens of trains moving across the country, the last formal railroad dinners were served. There was no announcement. There was no ceremony. The passengers who sat down in those dining cars had no idea it was the end. They looked at the menu. They ordered. The attendants brought the food on white linen, with real silver, the way it had always been done. They ate and watched the dark country move outside the window. When they finished, the attendants cleared the table. The train moved on. Nobody took a photograph of that meal. Nobody recorded the names of the cooks. It happened, and then it was over, as if it had never existed at all. These meals were not relics of luxury. They were a standard, a decision made deliberately and held to across thousands of miles of track and decades of travel, a decision that the act of sitting down to eat on a moving train was worth doing properly, that the person sitting across from you, whoever they were, deserved a cloth napkin and a real plate. That food made from scratch in a room smaller than your kitchen, at speed, was worth the effort. Here is the challenge. Pick one dish from this list. Make it this week, not from a package from the beginning. Sit down at a table to eat it, not on a couch, not in a car. Eat it slowly. Then leave a comment telling me what you made and whose name came to mind while you were eating it. The dining car is gone, but the meal does not have to be.